you all for coming. My name is Ellen Harvey-Collins. I'm the curator of the Art Space Gallery. We've been working together with Rebecca to bring her work to Fresno City College since about July. It's my pleasure to introduce Rebecca. The exhibition on view kind of brings together three different bodies of work. A portrait series, You Are Here, which is really kind of representing the underrepresented women who work in the arts. The Potato Eaters, Rebecca's large body of work that really kind of investigates her family's relationship to the land. And then a new body of work with these two sculptural installations that include light and sound and the kind of movement of the silk. So it's really exciting to be able to bring these new projects to the gallery and to have the Art Space Gallery be a space for experimentation this way. And thank you so much for your generosity and flexibility in allowing us to make that happen. I just want to thank Neil Vanderpool, Dean of the FPCA Division, for his support. And I also want to thank the full-time faculty for their help in putting the show together. And I also want to thank Kevin Stewart McGee, who is not here right now, but I'm sure will be, right there, whose kind of idea, the seed of the exhibition, was planted by him and Rebecca almost over a year ago, I think. So with that, I will cede the floor. And thank you, welcome.
If this thing falls off, I apologize in advance because I don't have pockets. I want to thank you all for having me here. I've never been. Oh yeah, this is because I tend to go on and on, so I'm gonna time. I have a big timer that says, "Hurry up, you're still talking." I want to thank everyone. Kevin, thank you for initiating this and inviting me up here. Elena, you have been so generous in letting me sort of evolve this new body of work while we were talking and finish it 5 minutes before the show opened. So I appreciate that. Thank you to the students who were so curious and awesome and welcoming. And like I said, I've never been to Fresno before, and I love it. It's just a lovely place. So thanks for having me. So I start with this. This is me. This is when I was born. The art world kind of has a lot of trends that flow through it, and autobiography goes in and out of fashion, and it's been largely out of fashion lately in favor of more conceptual pursuits. But I start here because, let's see, this is where I'm from. That's the house I grew up in, and that is the reason I'm an artist. I came to art not out of curiosity or, intelligence or talent. I came to it out of desperation. I ran to it. And I grew up, I was the seventh kid of a seventh kid. And the environment that I grew up in was quite anti-intellectual, particularly for women. So I was encouraged not to go to college. I was encouraged to get married as soon as possible and to start having babies like my 5 sisters did. And I didn't want to, so I didn't. And I lost a sense of where I was from and had to figure out a sense of where I would go. And the art world was that place. And the difference for me was I was coming from a place that was full of answers, had an answer for every single question you could possibly have. But it didn't like questions very much. And I went to the art world, which was very embracing of questions and allowed me to ask and ask and ask, so I did. I went from my hometown to Portland, Oregon to study at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. I show you this not because the work is very good, but because I think it's interesting to see a few things that have followed me through my whole career. I have always been a painter, and I've always done mixed media sculpture. And when I graduated, when I got my undergraduate degree, I was at an age where none of my siblings had passed that age without being married and having children. And I was getting a piece of paper, which is very intangible. and was really anxiety provoking, honestly, because what my siblings had done before me was so concrete. They had babies, they had houses, they had spouses. And I had this piece of paper which was just full of more questions. So I did my thesis show. It was called On the Threshold, and I threw myself away. And I made this dress and this dress. This is when I couldn't afford good photography, so you have to forgive me for that. The dress is made all out of eggshells. And then all of the trim on the dress is made of Marlboro 100 light cigarette butts that were smoked by my best friend in the world. And every button is made of a dime, 2 cross straight pins, and an aspirin. And the bureau in the back, you see here, was covered with poetry, and when you pick up that phone, it was me reading the poems. And the poems were all about this confusing situation of, you know, where I was in life, what I wasn't getting, what I was getting. And you can see the dress lit up from the inside, and above the bureau was this triple-headed self-portrait, where I was looking at myself, or myselves, all of the different versions of who I was and who I could possibly be. And then at the bottom of the dress was this little burned box with a cowboy on it, a little boy cowboy, who was actually the father. It was a picture of the father of my boyfriend at the time, who ended up becoming my husband and the father of my children. And so I think this is interesting because it sets out a lot of things that I continue to pursue: autobiography, mixed media sculpture, painting, and portraiture. I went from the Pacific Northwest College of Art, which is a very technically oriented school, a school that teaches 4 years of figure drawing, 4 years of sculpture. I learned to weld, I can woodcut, I can do ceramics, I learned printmaking, I learned lithography, silkscreen, etching. I learned how to make things, and so that was a real gift. At the same time, they were very wary of more conceptual things. So I was the first mixed media installation to ever be allowed from that particular college. And then I ended up going to UCLA for my graduate degree. And they didn't care at all if I could make things. They didn't care one whit about lithography or ceramics. They were all about conceptual work and reading Lacan and Freud and Barthes. And at first I was kind of in the weeds. I was terrified. But it became very important for me, and it was an important point in the development of me. I look at it simply as me learning how to make things, and then me being able to think and talk about those things that I had made. And that's important because it is another very important crossing point in my work, in that the brain and the body are always fused into one thing. And I don't see these pursuits of making objects and presenting conceptual ideas as being mutually exclusive. I see the best work as being a marriage of those two things together. Because I think, and particularly with painting, I think painting is a wonderful opportunity to take an idea that the brain develops and throw it through the body. And the body changes it, and the body has its own intelligence and its own opinion, and it morphs the idea into something other. And the object ends up being this wonderful presentation of both the connection of the brain and the body and the distance between those two things. And that seems very human to me. So the first thing I did was, after school, I was very lucky. I had a very difficult time getting people to look at my work in graduate school. And then out of happenstance, I just had, well, I'll tell you the quick anecdote, which is we have these open studios at UCLA where people come in, very important people in the art world in Los Angeles come through. But I was very naive and I didn't know who anyone was. And there was this guy who stopped, and he had little round glasses, and he said, "Well, I love these pictures. Do you have more?" And I said, "Sure, I'll go get them." And I walked to the racks, and one of the students said, "You must be so excited And I was like, I know, someone's looking at my work, it is awesome. And she said, and she was looking at me like, you're a dum-dum. Do you know who that is? And I said, no, who is it? She said, that's Robert Shapazian. He's the director of Gagosian Gallery. And I said, a gallery? Like, I didn't know who Gagosian was. And I was very excited, but it was good that I probably didn't know because I couldn't put on artists. And so he looked at the work and he gave me my very first show. That was before I graduated, and the other two people in this show were Chris Burden and Ed Richey. So it was pretty good luck. And really, literally 3 weeks before that, I had paintings in a hair salon on Melrose. So, but it turns out I actually went with a different gallery because Ellie Louver is the gallery that represents me now in Los Angeles. And they're much more of a long game gallery. They love painting. Their pace is slower. They encourage looking. These paintings are not paintings that would be on the cover of Flash Art. So this is my first series of paintings. I'm not going to tell the individual stories of each painting because I want to get through a lot tonight. But I show them because the whole show title was Thin Skin, and it's all based on where I grew up again. So this is the basement of the house that I grew up in with the same green shag carpet that I lived with my entire life. This is my father's Cadillac. It's called Diamond Tuck. That painting, the Cadillac is big as an actual Cadillac. So these are very big paintings. And it's, again, very important. You see me evolving this idea of fusing the brain with the body, conceptual work with the physicality of the paint. What I love about the physicality of the paint is the narrative can escape you a little bit. The other reason I show this work is because I developed this real interest in the multiple layers of work. So my work has always, like I said, come from that moment of leaving home and finding art and my passions. It's personal, it's autobiographical, but it would be a tragedy if it stopped there. I don't want the work to only live as a story about my life. So I'm also always fusing things at other levels. Cultural, pop culture, art history, world history, all of those things, lowbrow, highbrow, all the layers that I can get into a painting, I try to get into a painting. So this painting I will tell you about, which is called Discipline. And it's called Discipline, it's the back half of that house that you saw. And I had gone, one of the very first big shows I saw at MoMA when I was 18 years old, when I walked in and there was a Mondrian show. And I didn't think I was going to like Mondrian. I didn't think he had anything to say to me. I thought he was too rigid and I wasn't into abstract work. And the sweep of this show was so beautiful. It was chronologically ordered. And it started with these incredible observational trees that start to break into facets like Cezanne, and they become cubist. And then they become more and more reductive. And then they turn into these squares of primary colors, red, yellow, blue, black lines. And he gets super severe. And then he gets older and the world changes and he loses control, honestly, over his hand. He can't make the same pictures he made before. The Harlem Renaissance happens. Jazz comes into New York City. Politics are different. Civil rights is starting to come to the front. And he makes Boogie Woogie Broadway at the end of his life, which is kind of shimmery and much smaller squares, and it's very dazzling and very imperfect. And he actually uses tape in there as part of the painting because he couldn't rule the areas the same way he could before. And I had this aha moment, seeing that arc of the career and thinking, we always think of those one paintings as his paintings, you know, red, yellow, blue, black lines. But they're all his paintings. That whole arc of his life is what he made. And to reduce him to one period is just not true. I also love that show because I love discipline. There's a part of my personality that buys the Martha Stewart magazine at the checkout stand. I will admit that freely. There is a part of me that likes clean lines, and I wash my hair every day. I don't care what they say. They think it makes it more healthy if you don't. I don't care. I like discipline. I miss discipline. And when I left a very ordered life, I kind of mourned the loss of that. At the same time, I love my freedom. I'm very happy to have an open life that has a lot of loose ends in it. So this painting is an ode to Mondrian, and it's an ode to my dad. If you look at it, it's got the gray separating it down the center and through the middle. And there's a red, yellow, and blue room. And of course, Mondrian would probably roll over in his grave thinking of a picture, you know, messing around with his structure. But also it's about my life and living in a life of discipline and structure, and how there are very beautiful things about that, and how there are terrible things about that that can be very restrictive and frightening. Again, this is another reference. I won't go the whole thing, but they're personal references, and then you can see there's influence of abstract expressionism in here. Jackson Pollock. This is a 9-foot tall painting, so these are very gestural. Most of my work is much more physical in person than you can tell in reproduction. This is it's a very dark image, but this is called Radiate, and I'll tell you a quick anecdote because I talk a lot about my dad today. This is my dad's pool, and we have this very complicated relationship, and he came to the show, and he said, "That's my pool." And he said, "There's a naked girl in my pool." And he was being good-natured about it, but, you know, kind of grilling me about it, and I said, "Well, Dad, you know the funnier thing? You know the only time you can get a naked girl in your pool?" And he said, "When?" And I said, "When you're at church." So he actually laughed, which was a good thing. And this is, again, about where I grew up, the energy of that house. The next major show I did at LA Louvre was literally based on the architecture of my parents' house. So this is actually usually a very clean white cube space that you walk into. And we built it in to look exactly like the entrance to my parents' house. And those doors are my parents' front doors. They went without their front doors for 3 months in the middle of the winter in a very cold place. And so I was interested again in the multiple levels, in talking about the personal and then these other levels. This particular show is called Poltergeist, and depending on when you were born, you may or may not know the pop culture reference, which was, it was this big blockbuster movie when I was a kid, Steven Spielberg movie. But it's also about, it's a German word for kitchen ghosts. And I think it has many levels. And the way it's been painted, you can see here closer up. My mother, above our door in the 70s, a lot of women were tool painting, doing this decorative painting. And it said the Campbell home on top of the door, and I created that with this poltergeist theme. But instead of tool painting, I did it in a very thick, macho impasto palette knife painting to bring another reference, and what we value and what we think is decorative and what we think is important, what we think is valuable, what we think we can throw away because it's just some housewife's fad that she's taking busy work doing. Each one of the bricks around them, which you can see here, again, I'm playing with the idea of high and low culture. So together they end up being, they end up being kind of a prop, like the lowest form of art, like a scene prop. And then taken one by one, the gallery charges $250 a brick. So they end up being the highest art form, this abstract, non-narrative, pure paint kind of form. And then I need to go through these more quickly. But this is a 14-foot by 14-foot avocado tree, reinforced with steel and fiberglass, covered with a hand-tailored black velvet dress, and scattered with a flock of hand-blown glass birds that are full of Windex.